The first step is to get my raw epoxy casting ready for paint.
I already put automotive primer on. That's the black that you see on the back. And then it's got a super flat chalked brown spray paint, primed and ready to start the scenic job. So I'm going to begin by kind of rubbing into these hieroglyphics first before I start airbrushing and adding some highlights. So one of the keys here is that you gotta get the paint just thick enough or just liquidy enough that it's doing what you want. So for instance, these hieroglyphics are tending to need a little bit of a thicker paint so that it stays in there and just doesn't run off. Whereas if it was just like in an open area, you know, I might want something a little bit more runny so that it's not quite as opaque, but I want these to really stand out because they're kind of a feature that will disappear if they don't have a little bit of highlight. So if you see me do this multiple times, it's because I wasn't quite happy the first time. It's very easy to remove too much. If you want to go kind of flat and perpendicular with the surface. So with this sponge, I'm trying to use just this kind of flat area to kind of bring back a little bit of the dark brown. And eventually you'll get there. You want the hair to pick up a lot of you know, in the deep recesses. So it really just kind of takes a big overall coat. And sometimes it helps if you just kind of let it dry just a tiny bit. And this is really just a first step. Knock that down a bit. So this is just regular household paint. It's an exterior grade, completely flat finish, so that it'll look kind of chalky when it's done. But with the automotive primer and then the flat the Krylon brown, it should adhere pretty well. I mean, it's not something you would want to keep outdoors all the time, but I mean, for a prop, it's perfectly fine. You know, it's all water-based, so it's, you know, I'm not really worried about it being on my hands and that kind of thing. That may be a little too subtle, but you know, you just need the opportunity to just keep going at it instead of going too far with it. It's a little harder to bring back the dark browns than it is to just kind of do this in layers. So the face, of course, is very unique because you want it to look like a face. So I sort of made this exception for the face, made it a little bit softer. But right now I'm just going to give it a little once over to kind of tie it in with everything else. So this kind of follows the same logic where it is sort of that film negative. So I'm mostly going to take this away. Just want to leave a little bit and some of the cracks and imperfections. Kind of following the same logic. I'm going to diffuse this quite a bit. I'll give it that dry brush. You know, let this dry just a little bit and then take most of it away. Sponge up a little bit here because there's a lot of paint down there. I always want to have a wet sponge. Try dabbing up on these cracks. It seems a little heavy-handed. Sometimes if your brush is dry enough, it'll actually take the paint away instead of putting it down. That's what I'll do here. The cat thinks I'm talking to him. Hey, Luna, no. When I come back later with an airbrush, you know, I'll be able to stylize this a little bit and kind of more diffusely fill things in. But I think this is the most important step because, you know, the airbrush looks like an airbrush, and this is what's going to get you the kind of the aged, ancient look. So this may look like a haphazard thing where you're just throwing dirt everywhere, but this is actually a pretty time-consuming process if you do it, you know, get it just the way you want it. You want to make sure it's in the deep cracks, because that's really the only part that is going to stay, like where things would get, you know, hidden away, or if somebody wiped it down, or if the wind blew, it would still be there. So I'm getting a little dry brush here, trying to pick up on some of the edges. Oh, that's way too much. Trying to pick up on the edging of these bands so it stands out a little bit more. It would be better if this was a little bit drier, but I'm just gonna pull it up just like the other ones. So I've come in here with a lighter, kind of paler color to kind of add some highlights and some variations. So I've just kind of dabbed it on with a drier brush, and kind of dabbing it off. And it's just going to settle where it's going to settle. But I'm trying to model things a little bit so that it kind of contours to the shape. So again, I'll come back with an airbrush, but I want to kind of lay in, you know, foundation with the brush that it just looks a little more uneven. Time with the last one, I just had to be more subtle with the face. So it's, you don't want like a little splotchiness to kind of take away from the features. I'm going to kind of show you up close here. So this is very dry right now. So I'm just kind of going at like a 45-degree angle and just catching the edge. You know, kind of hooking onto some of the imperfections of the edge and feathering it out. You know, that kind of exaggerates some of the contours that are already there. You know, light and shadow will obviously help this out, but you know, your lighting's not always going to catch everything, so it kind of exaggerates things. The idea is when you look at this thing, in the end you won't really be able to identify like any one technique, because there's so many different things going on and it's all kind of blended together. And that's why I do the airbrush second, because if you start with the airbrush, you know, you'll get that very kind of fake looking, you know, light and shadow, whereas I think this tends to be pretty natural because you're working with like the actual shapes that are there. So I just hook on to some of these ridges, because you only really be able to see those if the lighting is just perfect. This will help bring out some of that detailing. Just want to avoid it looking like a brush stroke. I'm trying to keep it pretty feathered. Like I said before, these are all completely flat exterior grade paints that are heavily watered down. Probably don't want to do any kind of gloss or even satin. It's just too much. You know, I'm kind of going for like a very dried out, dusty look. And in fact, I sprayed down a texturized paint. It's got like little pieces of sand in it. You know, and that way you probably can't see it with the camera, but that extra texture lets the dry brush like hook on to things a little bit more. You know, if it's a completely smooth surface, a little bit harder to do like a paint job like this. So like these kind of open areas where there's no detail to hook onto, that's kind of airbrush territory to me, because I can kind of give like a soft fill. You know, it's not going to look like a brush stroke. So I'm airbrushing the same exact house paint that I just watered down That way it's an exact match. I'm doing things that I couldn't really do with a brush. Now we're going to look at an exact feathering effect. Like when I fill in the cheekbones like this. You really can't do that with a brush exactly.